Hello there, my Twilight explorers. Tonight, we return to Forks, Washington, not through the eyes of the immortal, and not through the eyes of the girl who changed everything, but through the quiet, steady gaze of the man who stood in the doorway and watched it all unfold. Charlie Swan was a father, a policeman, and a man of very few words. But beneath that stillness, he noticed more than anyone ever gave him credit for. Tonight, we follow him through the entire story of Midnight Sun, one careful observation at a time. If there is a Twilight story you would love to fall asleep to next, tell me in the comments. I would love to create it for you. Alright, now get cozy. Close your eyes. Breathe in slowly. And let the quiet rain of Forks carry you gently to sleep. Charlie Swan had lived in Forks, Washington for most of his life, and he had long since stopped needing it to be anything other than what it was. It was a small town, the kind where the same families had occupied the same houses for 3 and 4 generations, where the diner on the main street had not changed its menu in living memory, where the police scanner in the station crackled mostly with minor traffic incidents, and the occasional domestic dispute that resolved itself before anyone had to get out of the car. It rained almost every day. The forest pressed in close on all sides, dark and green and perpetually damp, and the clouds sat so low over the valley that winter felt like living at the bottom of a lake. Tourists sometimes passed through on their way to the coast, looked around, and kept driving. Charlie did not mind any of this. He had tried once to want something larger. He had married a woman who burned with restless energy and a need for sun and movement and open horizons, and for a handful of years he had tried to be the kind of man who could keep up with her. He had failed at that, quietly and without drama, and Renee had taken their daughter to Phoenix, and Charlie had come back to Forks and gone back to work, and that was the end of it. He did not blame her. He did not particularly blame himself either. Some people were made for Forks, and some people were made for somewhere else, and Renee had always been somewhere else entirely, even during the years she had tried to make it work. He kept the house on the edge of town because it was his, because his father had lived there before him, because the familiarity of it suited the way he was built. The rooms were not decorated so much as simply occupied. His fishing gear leaned against the wall in the utility room. His jacket hung on the same hook by the door it had always hung on. The television in the living room was too large for the space, but he had bought it the previous year and did not regret it. The spare room upstairs the one that had been Bella's during her childhood visits, had a quilt on the bed and a small dresser and not much else. He had not added to it over the years. He was not sure what to add. He kept his routines because routines were the architecture of a life that worked even when it was quiet. He was up at 6 every morning, coffee measured and pressed before he was fully awake, eggs or toast, depending on whether he felt like washing a pan. He drove the cruiser to the station by 7:30, nodded to whoever was on the overnight shift, read through the night's reports over a second cup of coffee that was always worse than the one he made at home, but that he drank without complaint because it was there and it was hot. And he was not a man who required things to be better than adequate. By 8, he was usually doing something useful, or at least something that needed doing. He answered the phone and filed the paperwork and drove the occasional patrol through the residential streets north of town, and ate lunch at his desk from a brown bag he packed himself every morning. The job was not glamorous. Charlie had been police chief of Forks for 11 years, and in that time, he had dealt with drunk drivers and domestic incidents and the occasional missing tourist who had wandered off a trail and had to be retrieved, embarrassed and insect-bitten from somewhere out in the Olympic Peninsula. He had worked 2 serious accidents on the highway and 1 death in suspicious circumstances that had turned out to be not suspicious at all. Just sad in the particular way that accidents involving men who drank too much and drove too fast were always sad. He was good at the job, not because it demanded brilliance, but because it demanded steadiness. And Charlie Swan was, above almost everything else, a steady man. He did not raise his voice when it was not necessary. He did not make promises he could not keep. He wrote his reports with care and filed them correctly and returned phone calls the same day he received them. He treated people with the quiet baseline respect that he felt was owed to everyone, unless they gave him a specific reason to adjust that assessment downward, which some people did, and which he then adjusted without drama. He was not the kind of policeman who confused authority with importance. He wore the badge because somebody had to, and because he was suited to it, not because it made him feel large. The town knew him the way small towns know their officials, with a familiarity that stopped just short of intimacy, a collective trust built from years of his simply being present and reliable and not causing anyone trouble. The hardware store owner waved when he drove past. The woman at the diner saved him the corner booth on Friday afternoons without being asked, and he always left a good tip because she always remembered, and remembering deserved something. The kids at the high school said hello, and mostly meant it. He wasn't loved the way some men are loved, with noise and demonstration, but he was something quieter and more durable than that. He was trusted, which in a town like Forks was the more valuable currency. His closest friendship, the one that required no performance and no explanation, was with Billy Black. Billy lived down at La Push on the Quileute Reservation and had been Charlie's fishing companion for going on 15 years. The friendship had grown the way good ones do in adulthood, slowly and without fanfare, built from shared silences on the water and the occasional beer afterward, and the particular ease of 2 men who had both lost something significant and had decided not to make too much of it in each other's company. Billy's wife Sarah had died in a car accident when their children were still young, and Charlie's marriage had not survived its first decade, and somewhere in the arithmetic of those separate losses, they had found a reliable companionship that neither of them discussed because neither of them needed to. It existed. That was sufficient. They fished on the weekends when the weather permitted, which in Forks meant they fished in the rain and called it permitted anyway. They watched games together, Billy's truck or Charlie's living room, depending on the week. The volume turned up for Billy's hearing. Commentary exchanged in the sparse shorthand of men who'd been watching games together long enough to have developed a private language of grunts and silences. They talked about the fish and the game and the town, and occasionally, carefully, about their children. Billy had 3, his daughters Rachel and Rebecca mostly grown and gone out into the world. His youngest Jacob still at home on the reservation and growing at a rate that seemed to alarm everyone who had not seen him in a few months. Charlie had Bella. He did not talk about Bella as much as he thought about her. That was a Charlie Swan habit, thinking more than speaking, holding the important things in the part of himself that did not translate easily into words. He had her school photos on the refrigerator, the full progression of them, year by year, Renee sending them without being asked, because she was good about that, reliably good about the small gestures even when the larger ones had defeated her. He watched Bella age across those photos with the particular attention of her father, who had not been present for most of the aging, noting the slight changes in her face from one year to the next, the lengthening of her hair and then the cutting of it back, the careful smile she gave the school photographer every year without ever quite showing teeth. She had his colouring, his dark hair, but Renee's features, the fine bones and the shape of her eyes, and something in the set of her mouth that was entirely her mother. She visited in the summers, or had when she was younger. Those visits had been the uneven geography of his fatherhood. 2 weeks here, a few days there. The awkward business of entertaining a child who had grown up somewhere else and did not quite know how to be at ease in his house any more than he knew how to make her so. He had tried. He had taken her fishing, and she had been patient about it in the way that she was patient about things she did not especially enjoy, quietly and without complaint. He had taken her to the diner and she had eaten politely. They had watched movies together on the sofa with a careful distance between them that neither of them knew how to close. Not because there was anything wrong between them exactly, but because they had not accumulated enough shared time to know the geography of each other, to know which topics opened things up and which ones closed them down. He loved her. That was never the question. He loved her with a kind of ferocity that surprised him sometimes, catching him off guard in quiet moments, the feeling arriving without warning when he was doing something entirely unrelated, driving the patrol route or washing a coffee cup or reading through a report, and suddenly there it was, this enormous uncomplicated fact of loving his daughter, big enough to be almost uncomfortable in a man who was not built for large emotions expressed openly. He kept it where he kept most things. Inside, reliable, not going anywhere, not requiring an audience. The Cullen family had arrived in Forks several years before any of this, and they were, in Charlie's professional and personal assessment, unusual. Dr. Carlisle Cullen had taken a position at the hospital, and from everything Charlie had observed and heard, he was exceptional at his work. The nurses liked him with a consistency that went beyond professional courtesy. The other doctors spoke of him with respect that had no edge of competition in it, which was rare enough among doctors to be notable. Patients who had been treated by him spoke well of him in the particular unrehearsed way that Charlie trusted more than any formal credential. The simple testimony of ordinary people who had been frightened and had needed help and had received it from someone who seemed genuinely to want to give it. Carlisle Cullen was pale in the way some people from northern climates were pale, and he looked younger than his apparent age in a way Charlie attributed to genetics, and he possessed a calm so complete it occasionally felt less like a personality trait and more like a fundamental quality of the air around him. His wife Esme rarely appeared in town. His children, adopted, a detail the community had absorbed and filed away without much lasting interest, attended Forks High School and kept conspicuously to themselves. They were beautiful in a way that was difficult to look at directly, the kind of beauty that made people aware of their own faces, that registered in the peripheral vision even when you were trying not to look. They moved differently than other people, with a fluid economy of motion that Charlie noticed the way he noticed things that were slightly outside the expected range of normal without being classifiable as wrong. They drove together and sat together and maintained around themselves a perimeter of polite distance that no one in Forks had ever quite managed to breach. Charlie had no formal reason to be concerned about them. Nothing in his files, nothing through his radio, nothing from the community that constituted a complaint or a concern, or anything requiring his professional attention. Carlisle had donated equipment to the clinic and volunteered time at the free health days the county ran twice a year and had, by all accounts, saved the life of a man who had come into the emergency room in the middle of a serious cardiac event and who was still alive and fishing and attributing his survival to the pale doctor who had moved so fast that the nurses had trouble keeping up with him. And yet, Charlie Swan had spent 20 years learning to pay attention to the part of himself that registered something without being able to name it. It was not strictly a policeman's skill, or not only that, it was something older than that, the quiet animal instinct that noticed when a room felt subtly different, when a person's words and their body were telling two slightly different stories, when a thing was almost entirely right, but not quite entirely. He had learned not to act on that instinct without evidence, because acting without evidence was not policing. It was something else, something he did not want to be. But he had also learned, in 20 years, not to dismiss it. The Cullens registered something he could not name, something in the quality of their stillness, in the way they existed in public spaces, with the careful attention of people who were always, on some level, monitoring their own performance. He could not say what it meant. He did not know what it meant. It was not evidence of anything. It was just the quiet, patient note that the noticing part of him made in the margin, filed away against some future use that might never come. He filed it away and went back to work. The house was quiet that autumn, in the way it was always quiet. The rain against the roof and the scanner murmuring on the counter, and the refrigerator covered in Bella's school photos, and his jacket on its hook, and everything in its place. Charlie made his coffee and drove his cruiser and watched the rain come down over the green, dark town he had lived in all his life, and thought about his daughter in Phoenix and did not say much about any of it to anyone. That was his life. It was enough. It was, in its quiet and reliable way, good. And then Bella called and said she was coming home, and the quiet house, which had been quiet for so long, he had stopped hearing it as absence suddenly became something he could feel in every room. Charlie had known the phone call was coming for a few weeks before it arrived. Renee had mentioned in passing, during one of their occasional and carefully civil conversations about logistics and scheduling, that Bella was not entirely happy in Phoenix, that she was restless in a way that was hard to pin down, that she had been asking questions about Forks. Charlie had listened and said very little, because saying very little was what he did when something mattered enough that he did not trust himself to respond to it correctly in real time. When Bella called and said she wanted to come and live with him, his first instinct was to ask if something was wrong. His second instinct, arriving a fraction of a second later and overriding the first, was to say yes before she had the chance to change her mind. He said yes. He kept his voice level and warm and did not let any of the larger feeling into it, because he did not want to frighten her with the size of his wanting her there. They worked out the details efficiently, the way the Swan family handled most things, practically and without excessive emotion. She would finish the semester in Phoenix and come to Forks in January. She would need her room back, which was already hers and had always been hers even when she was not in it. She would need a way to get around, because Forks was not a city and there was no reasonable public transport, and Charlie's cruiser was not available for teenage use. The truck was Billy's idea. Billy had Jacob's old Chevy sitting in the yard, a 1953 model that had been rebuilt more times than either of them could accurately account for, solid and enormous, and the color of rust in the places where it was not actually rust. Billy offered it for a price that Charlie recognized as generosity, wearing the costume of commerce, and Charlie accepted it on the same terms. And the truck was parked in the driveway of the house on the edge of town, waiting for Bella before she had even packed her bags in Phoenix. He prepared her room with the focused practicality he brought to most tasks that concealed an emotional weight he was not going to examine directly. He bought new bedding because the old set was faded, and she deserved something that had not been sitting in a closet for years. He cleared the dresser and put fresh shelf paper in the drawers. He found a small desk at the hardware store's second-hand section and carried it upstairs himself, positioning it under the window where the light was best on the rare days when there was light. He stood in the doorway of the finished room and looked at it for a long moment, and then he went downstairs and made coffee, and did not think too carefully about how much he was hoping she would be happy there. January arrived with its characteristic Forks grimness, the sky a uniform grey that began at the tree line and extended upward without interruption, the rain steady and indifferent. Charlie drove to the airport in Port Angeles with the heater running and the radio on low, and a complicated feeling in his chest that he was not going to name out loud to anyone. He saw her before she saw him, coming through the arrivals gate with her bag over one shoulder and that careful expression she wore in new situations, the one that gave nothing away until she had assessed the room. She was taller than he remembered, or maybe he had just been working from the photographs too long, measuring her against the person in the images rather than the real one. She looked like herself. She looked like Bella. He raised a hand and she saw him, and something in her face shifted, not quite a smile, but in the direction of one, and Charlie felt the tightness in his chest ease by a fraction. The drive back to Forks was quiet, in the way their time together had always had a tendency toward quiet, but it was not uncomfortable. Charlie pointed out landmarks as they entered town, things that had changed and things that had not, filling the silence with the small geography of the place she had come back to. Bella looked out the window with an attention that suggested she was genuinely taking it in, cataloguing it, trying to locate herself in it. He did not push for conversation. He had learned over the years of summer visits that pushing Bella toward conversation was the surest way to get less of it. She saw the truck in the driveway before he had time to prepare a proper introduction, and the sound she made, something between surprise and what might have been genuine pleasure, settled something in Charlie that had been braced for the possibility of disappointment. She asked about it, and he explained about Billy and the history of it, and she ran a hand along the side of it with something that looked like fondness. And Charlie thought that perhaps he had done at least one thing right. Inside, the house was warm and smelled of the dinner he had spent the better part of the afternoon attempting, a pot of pasta sauce from a recipe he had found in a cookbook that had been in the kitchen for years without being opened. It was not remarkable food, he knew that, but it was hot and ready, and the effort of it was the point. And Bella ate it without complaint, and said it was good in a way that he chose to believe was at least partially true. They settled into the rhythms of cohabitation with the careful negotiation of two people who loved each other and did not entirely know each other. Charlie established early that he was not going to crowd her. He had his routines, and she could build hers around them or alongside them or entirely separately from them, as she preferred. He left her to her room in the evenings and did not knock unless it was necessary. He stocked the kitchen with things he thought she might want, guessing at her preferences from what he remembered and what he could observe. And when he guessed wrong, he quietly replaced things without comment. She started school the following Monday, and Charlie felt the particular anxiety of a parent sending a child into a new environment without being able to follow and smooth the way. He heard things in the way that residents of small towns hear things, through the gradual accumulation of unremarkable conversations, the woman at the diner mentioning that her nephew was in Bella's year and had sat with her at lunch. The hardware store owner saying his daughter had come home talking about the new girl from Phoenix. The picture that assembled itself from these fragments was reassuring in its ordinariness. Bella was finding her footing. She was making acquaintances. She was managing. He was glad. He was also aware, in the way of fathers who pay attention, that managing and thriving were not the same thing, and that Bella's particular brand of managing had always involved keeping more inside than she let show. He did not push. He offered what he could, which was the quiet consistency of dinner on the table, and a house that was warm, and a father who was present without being intrusive. And he hoped it was enough. The first sign that something had shifted came toward the end of Bella's first week at Forks High School. She came home from school one afternoon with a quality of silence that was different from her ordinary quiet. Not unhappy, he did not think, but interior in a new way, as if something had happened that she was turning over in her mind and had not yet decided what to do with. Charlie noticed it the way he noticed most things, without comment, filed away, waiting for context. He didn't ask. He made dinner and they ate, and he told her about a minor incident at the station that had been more comic than serious, a story he had selected specifically for its lack of weight, and she smiled at the right moments and asked a small question about one of the deputies. And the evening passed as evenings in the Swan household passed, without drama and without resolution. But he kept the observation where he kept things that might matter later. Something had happened at school. Something had registered in his daughter in a way that ordinary first-week adjustments did not tend to register. He would wait and see. Charlie Swan was very good at waiting and seeing. The van incident happened on a Thursday during Bella's second week. He was at the station when the call came in. A report of an accident in the school parking lot. A vehicle that had lost control on the ice and collided with another. No serious injuries reported. Charlie was in the cruiser and moving before the details had fully resolved. Because the school parking lot and no serious injuries could become the school parking lot, and very serious injuries in the time it took to drive from the station. And Bella was at that school, and Charlie Swan was not a man who waited for confirmation when his daughter was within the radius of a reported accident. He arrived to find the situation already resolving itself into the controlled aftermath of a near miss, rather than the jagged scene of an actual catastrophe. Tyler Crowley's van had slid on the ice and struck several parked vehicles, and the initial report of no serious injuries appeared to be accurate, with one complicating detail that Charlie heard from 3 separate witnesses before he had been on scene for 5 minutes. Bella had been in the path of the van and had not been in the path of the van, and the explanation for how she had moved from one state to the other was not entirely consistent across the accounts he was receiving. He found her sitting on the cold ground near the damaged vehicles, a Cullen boy crouched beside her, both of them apparently unhurt. Charlie felt the specific physical relief of a parent confirming with their own eyes that their child is intact, a relief so complete it took a moment before the questions began to form. He spoke to Bella briefly, checking her over with the practical efficiency of a man who needed to know she was physically all right before he could engage with anything else. She was pale and perhaps shaken, but uninjured, and she told him she was fine in the particular tone she used when she was fine, but did not want to discuss the surrounding circumstances. He spoke to witnesses. He spoke to Tyler Crowley, who was shaken and remorseful, and provided an account of the van's trajectory that, if accurate, should have placed Bella in serious danger of injury. And he looked at Edward Cullen, the boy who had been beside her, who met Charlie's eyes with a composure that most teenagers in the aftermath of a parking lot accident did not naturally possess. The story he assembled from the available accounts was this: Edward Cullen had been some distance from Bella when the van lost control and had then been beside her, and Bella had been moved out of the van's primary path. The precise mechanics of how this had occurred were, depending on which account he credited, either fortunate positioning or something his witnesses were struggling to describe accurately. Charlie looked at Edward Cullen for a long moment. The boy looked back at him without discomfort. Charlie let it go. He had no evidence of anything other than a fortunate outcome and a witness pool that had been frightened and was now reconstructing a fast event with the unreliable instruments of human memory. he was grateful Bella was unharmed. He told her so that evening, more directly than he usually said things directly, because sometimes a person needed to hear plainly that they mattered. She seemed surprised by it, which told him something about how accustomed she had become to his usual quiet. He made a private note to be less usual about it, when he could manage. The house that night felt different than it had in January, and different again from how it had felt in the long, quiet years before she arrived. It was still the same house, same rain on the same roof, same scanner on the same counter, but there was a light on upstairs that had not been on for years, and the sound of someone moving carefully around the spare room that had stopped being spare. And Charlie Swan sat in his chair with the television on low and felt, underneath all the questions he was already beginning to accumulate, something that was simply and stubbornly glad. The change in Bella was gradual enough that someone less attentive might have missed it entirely. Charlie did not miss it. He was by nature and by profession a man who noticed the small incremental shifts in the things he was paying attention to, and he was paying attention to his daughter with the focused care of someone who had been given a second chance at proximity and did not intend to waste it. It started with the quality of her distraction. Bella had always been a contained person, interior in the way that some people simply were, more comfortable inside their own thoughts than outside them. Charlie recognized the trait because he shared it, but the distraction that settled over her in the weeks following the van incident was different from her ordinary inwardness. It had a direction to it. It was pointed somewhere specific, and Charlie, who could not read her mind but had spent enough years reading people to know the difference between someone thinking about nothing and someone thinking about something they had decided not to share, filed the observation away without comment. He heard the name before he had a face to put to it with any clarity beyond what he had seen briefly in the school parking lot. Jessica Stanley's mother mentioned at the diner that her daughter had said Bella was spending time in biology class with the Cullen boy, the quiet one, the one who sat at the back. Charlie drank his coffee and nodded and asked no follow-up questions and drove back to the station with the name sitting in the practical part of his mind alongside everything else he was keeping track of. Edward Cullen. Charlie had seen him clearly only once in the parking lot aftermath. The impression had been brief but sufficient. A boy who was too composed for the situation, who looked at a police chief with the steady eyes of someone who was not worried about what a police chief might find. Most teenagers confronted with a uniformed authority figure in the aftermath of any kind of incident produce some version of anxiety, whether they had done anything wrong or not. It was reflexive, almost biological, the instinct of young people in the presence of official scrutiny. Edward Cullen had produced nothing of the kind. He'd been simply and completely calm, and at the time Charlie had attributed this to shock or to the particular temperament of some unusually self-possessed young people. He was less certain of that attribution now. The first direct conversation about Edward happened over a Tuesday dinner, approximately 3 weeks after Bella had started school. She mentioned him by name while passing the bread. A casual reference dropped into the middle of a sentence about a biology assignment, and Charlie watched her face in the moment she said it and saw the careful neutrality she was working to maintain. He had used that same careful neutrality himself enough times in his life to recognize it for what it was: effort, not ease. She was monitoring how the name landed. She was watching him from the corner of her eye, the way people watched for reactions they were not certain they wanted to provoke. "The Cullen boy," Charlie said, keeping his own voice equally level. "From the parking lot." "He sits next to me in biology," Bella said. "We work on labs together." Charlie nodded and said nothing further and passed the salt, and the conversation moved on to other things, and he did not push. But the observation joined the others he was accumulating. She had said the name with a care that was trying to pass itself off as casualness, and she had been watching him for his reaction, and both of these things told him considerably more than she had intended them to. He found himself thinking about it that evening, sitting in his chair with the television on, and the sound turned low, which was a habit he had when he was thinking about something, and needed the noise as backdrop rather than content. He thought about what he actually knew, which was not much. A boy who had been near his daughter during an accident, who sat beside her in a class, whose name she said with studied lightness. None of it constituted anything he could act on or even reasonably object to. All of it added up to something he could not quite name. He tried in the days that followed to find the right entry point for the conversation he was not naturally equipped to have. He was a man who communicated most fluently through action and presence, who showed the things that mattered to him by doing rather than saying. And the particular conversation that was assembling itself as necessary was one that required words in a specific order. Words of the kind that did not come easily to him under the best of circumstances. He rehearsed versions of it in the cruiser on the patrol route, which was the place where he did most of his thinking that required privacy, and each version sounded either too heavy or too dismissive by the time he reached the end of it. He attempted it on a Saturday morning, catching Bella at the kitchen table with her cereal and a book, the rain doing its usual work against the windows, and the kitchen warm with the smell of the coffee he had just made. He sat down across from her with his mug and worked up to it through 2 full minutes of silence, which Bella sat through with the patient forbearance of someone who had learned that Charlie Swan arrived at things on his own schedule, and that waiting him out was more productive than trying to hurry him. "So," Charlie said, "this Edward Cullen." Bella looked up from her book. "What about him?" Charlie turned his mug a quarter turn on the table. "I want to make sure you're being smart about things, about the people you spend your time with." "I'm always smart about things," Bella said, which was true enough that he could not straightforwardly argue with it. "I know you are," Charlie said. "I just mean..." He paused again. He was not covering himself in glory here. "You know, if there's anything you wanted to talk about anyone, I'm around. That's all I'm saying." Bella looked at him with an expression he recognized as the one she wore when she was deciding how much to give him. It was not an unkind expression. It was the expression of a person who was genuinely considering what was being offered and how much of themselves to offer in return. "His father seems like a decent man," Charlie added, which was not what he had intended to say, but was at least true, and seemed like it might constitute a bridge towards something more substantive. Bella's expression softened at that, perceptibly. "Carlisle's been very kind," she said. Edward's family is very close. They're a good family, Dad. I know they seem different. I know people in town find them a bit strange, but they're good people. I'm sure they are, Charlie said, which was his attempt at meaning it, even while not being entirely certain he meant it. Be careful. That's all I'm asking. I'm always careful, Bella said, and returned to her book, and Charlie drank his coffee and accepted that this was probably as far as that particular conversation was going to travel. It was shortly after this that Billy Black came to visit, and the visit was not the ordinary kind. Billy arrived on a Sunday with Jacob in tow. Jacob unfolding himself from the truck with a particular energy of a boy who had grown several inches since Charlie had last properly looked at him and had not quite finished adjusting to the new dimensions of himself. They came in and settled in the living room in the familiar way. Charlie getting beers for himself and Billy, and a soda for Jacob. The game already on. The comfortable silence of the usual Sunday afternoon settling around them. Charlie let it settle. He knew Billy well enough to know that something was sitting beneath the surface of this visit, and that Billy would surface it when he was ready. It was Bella, coming home from an errand in town, that changed the temperature of the afternoon. She came through the front door with a paper bag from the grocery store, said hello to Billy and Jacob with the genuine warmth she reserved for people she actually liked. Jacob immediately brightening in a way that was entirely readable to anyone paying attention, and then disappeared into the kitchen. The sounds of her moving around in there, putting things away, opening and closing the refrigerator, carried clearly into the living room. Billy waited until those sounds had settled into the quiet of Bella absorbed in something else. Then he turned to Charlie with an expression that Charlie had not seen on his face in many years. Not the mild concern of a man who worried as a general habit, but the focused gravity of someone who had made a decision to say a specific thing and had arrived at the moment of saying it. "You need to keep Bella away from the Cullens, Charlie," Billy said. Charlie set his beer down on the side table. He did it slowly, deliberately, the way he did things when he wanted to make sure he was thinking clearly before he responded. "Why?" he said. "Because they're not safe for her to be around," Billy said. "I know how that sounds. I know you want something you can write in a report, but I'm asking you as your friend, as someone whose family has known about that family for a very long time, to trust me on this. Billy," Charlie kept his voice even, "if you have something specific, something I can actually work with, you need to tell me what it is. You know, I can't act on a feeling." "It's not a feeling," Billy said. "It's knowledge. It's just not the kind of knowledge that comes with a paper trail." Charlie looked at him steadily. In 15 years of friendship, he had learned to distinguish between Billy being overcautious, which happened, and Billy being serious in a way that deserved full attention, which was rarer and always worth taking seriously when it occurred. This was the second kind. He could see it in the set of Billy's face and in the way Jacob had gone very still beside him. The stillness of a young person pretending not to listen while listening carefully. "What kind of knowledge is it then?" Charlie said. Billy was quiet for a moment, turning his beer bottle in his hands. "The Quileute have long memories," he said finally. "Longer than the most people find it comfortable to account for. That family has been in this area before. Not these specific people maybe, but that family. We know what they are, Charlie." and what they are is not something your daughter should be getting close to. Charlie held Billy's gaze across the familiar space of his living room. The rain was coming down steadily outside, and the game was still going on the television, and he was aware of both of these things, with the peripheral attention of a man whose primary focus was on what was directly in front of him. "Billy," he said carefully, "you know I respect you. You know I take what you say seriously. But what you're describing is not something I can act on. I can't go to Bella and tell her to stay away from her family because of something her father's friend knows from a tradition I don't have access to. She would ask me why. I would not have an answer she would accept. I would not have an answer I would accept." "I know," Billy said. "I'm not asking you to arrest anyone. I'm asking you to protect your daughter." "I am protecting my daughter," Charlie said, and he heard something come into his own voice that he had not entirely intended, a firmness that surprised him slightly. "I'm watching. I'm paying attention. That's what I can do." Billy nodded slowly. He did not look satisfied, but he looked like a man who had said what he came to say and understood that it had landed as far as it was going to land for now. They watched the remainder of the game with a quiet between them that was slightly different in texture from the usual Sunday quiet. Something unresolved sitting in it that neither of them addressed again that afternoon. After Billy and Jacob had gone, Charlie sat in the empty living room for a while without turning the television off, the game continuing without his attention. He thought about Billy's face. He thought about the phrase "long memories" and what it implied without specifying. He thought about his own reflexive resistance to what Billy was telling him, and he examined that resistance with the honesty he tried to apply to his own instincts, asking himself whether he was dismissing Billy's concern because it genuinely lacked merit, or because it was easier to dismiss it than to act on it. He did not reach a comfortable conclusion either way. He thought about the parking lot again, as he had found himself doing intermittently since the incident. He thought about the version of events that the witnesses had described, the trajectory of the van, the position Bella should have been in, the position she had ended up in. He thought about Edward Cullens' face in those few minutes afterward, the complete absence of the adrenaline and residual shock that most people carried in their body after a near miss. He thought about the way Bella had shut down his questions that evening with a smooth consistency that was not quite natural, a consistency that suggested she had thought about what she was going to say before she said it. He was a policeman. He knew the difference between a person being private and a person managing information. Bella was doing the second thing, and had been doing it since the van incident, and he had been patient about it because she was his daughter, and he was trying not to crowd her, and because he had nothing concrete to press on. But patience was not the same as inattention, and Charlie Swan had never been inattentive. He got up eventually and washed the beer bottles and turned off the kitchen light and stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment, listening to the quiet of the house above him. Bella in her room, the rain outside, everything apparently in order. He was not alarmed. He was not ready to be alarmed, but he was, in the careful, measured way of a man who trusted his own observations, less certain than he had been a month ago that everything in his daughter's new life was as straightforward as it appeared. He went upstairs and got ready for bed and lay in the dark listening to the rain and thought about what Billy had said, and about the gap between the kind of knowing that came with evidence and the kind that arrived from somewhere older and harder to explain, and about which kind he was actually dealing with here. He did not sleep for a while. When he did, it was with the particular restlessness of a man who had questions he did not yet know how to ask, and answers he was not yet sure he wanted. The trip to Port Angeles was Bella's idea, or at least it had originated with Bella and her new friends, and Charlie had no reasonable objection to it. Jessica Stanley and Angela Weber were, by every account he had gathered through the ordinary social osmosis of a small town, decent girls from decent families. Angela's father was the Methodist minister. Jessica's mother he had spoken to at the diner on a number of occasions, and found her harmless, if somewhat more interested in other people's business than was strictly necessary. As chaperones went, Charlie could have done worse than a group of high school girls shopping for dresses on a Saturday afternoon in a town 45 minutes away. He told Bella to check in when she arrived and to call if anything came up. And he meant both of these things with the quiet seriousness he brought to most things he said to her. And she agreed with the patient tolerance of a teenager who understood that her father's instructions came from a place of genuine care, even when they were unnecessary. He watched the truck pull out of the driveway and then went back inside and made himself another coffee and settled in for a Saturday afternoon that was his own, which was a thing he had not had in some weeks, and which he found he did not entirely know what to do with now that he had it. He watched part of a game. He did some paperwork he had brought home from the station, a habit Renee had always found maddening, and that he had maintained without apology in the years since her departure, because it was simply how he was. He called Harry Clearwater about the fishing trip they had been loosely planning for the following weekend, and they talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular, in the way that men who have been friends for a long time talk when they are not talking about anything specific. Harry asked after Bella, and Charlie said she was settling in well, and meant it mostly. The evening came in the way Falk's evenings came, gradually and then completely, the grey afternoon deepening without any particular transition into a grey dark. Charlie put the paperwork aside and heated up the leftover chili from Thursday and ate it at the kitchen table with the scanner on low and the radio providing background noise he was not actually listening to. He checked his phone. Bella had texted when they arrived, as agreed, a brief message that communicated the essential information and nothing more, which was very much his daughter's approach to communication, and which he accepted as sufficient. He was washing his bowl when his phone rang. He looked at the screen and saw a number he did not recognize, and answered it the way he always answered unfamiliar numbers, with his name and a tone that was professionally neutral. Chief Swan. The voice on the other end was young and male and composed in a way that registered immediately. "This is Edward Cullen. I have Bella with me. She's all right. I wanted you to hear that first before I explained what happened." Charlie set the bowl down in the sink with care. "What happened?" he said. "She got separated from her friends in town," Edward said. "She ended up in a part of Port Angeles that wasn't safe, and some men were bothering her. I happened to be nearby and I got her out of the situation. She's not hurt. She's with me now, and we're going to get some dinner, and then I'll drive her home. I just thought you should know." Charlie stood in his kitchen with the phone against his ear and the scanner murmuring on the counter, and the chilli smell still in the air. And he went through the information he had just been given with the systematic attention he brought to incoming reports. Bella had gotten separated from her friends. She had been in an unsafe area. Men had been bothering her. Edward Cullen had been nearby. "Let me talk to her," Charlie said. There was a brief pause, and then Bella's voice, slightly unsteady but fundamentally intact. "Hey Dad, I'm okay, really. It was just a stupid wrong turn and Edward found me and everything's fine. Are you hurt?" "No." "These men, did they touch you?" "No." A pause. It didn't get that far. "Because Edward was there." "Yes." Charlie breathed out slowly through his nose. "All right. You're going to eat something, and then he's going to bring you straight home, and we're going to talk when you get here." "Okay," Bella said, and he could hear in the single word the particular relief of a person who'd been frightened and was now in the process of deciding how frightened they were actually going to let themselves feel. He hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment without moving. Then he put the bowl away and went to sit in his chair and turned the television on and did not watch it. Edward Cullen had been in Port Angeles on the same afternoon that Bella was in Port Angeles. Edward Cullen had been nearby when she was in trouble. Edward Cullen had been the one to call him rather than Bella herself, which suggested either that he'd taken charge of the situation in a way that Bella had allowed, or that Bella had been more shaken than she was letting on. Possibly both. Charlie had spent 20 years taking statements and assembling incident reports and learning to notice the shape of a story as well as its content. The shape of this story was not wrong exactly, but it had the quality of something that had been edited, something that had been given to him in the form that was most likely to satisfy, without quite answering all of the questions he would have if he sat down and thought carefully about it. He sat down and thought carefully about it. The most straightforward question was the one he had no way of answering from where he was sitting. What was Edward Cullen doing in Port Angeles that afternoon? It was plausible. People went to Port Angeles. There was nothing suspicious about a teenager from Forks driving to the nearest town of any real size on a Saturday. But Charlie had spoken to enough people over the years to know that plausible and true were not always the same thing, and the timing of it, the specific coincidence of Edward being nearby at the specific moment Bella needed someone nearby, sat in the back of his mind with the same quality as the parking lot incident. Twice now. The van in the school parking lot. Port Angeles on a Saturday evening. Twice this particular boy had been exactly where he needed to be, at the exact moment Charlie's daughter had needed someone to be there. Charlie was grateful. He was genuinely, completely grateful, in the way that parents are grateful when their children come home safe from situations that might have gone differently. That gratitude was real, and it was not complicated. But it existed alongside the other thing, the policeman's thing, the part of him that noticed patterns and took them seriously. Bella came home just after 9. Charlie was still in his chair, the television still on, and he heard the truck in the driveway, and then the front door, and then Bella's footsteps in the hallway. She appeared in the doorway of the living room, and she looked tired and pale, but fundamentally herself. And Charlie felt the tight thing in his chest ease by several degrees. "You hungry?" he said first, because she had mentioned getting dinner, and he did not know how much of that had actually happened. Edward took me to a restaurant, Bella said. I ate. Charlie nodded. Come sit down. She came and sat on the sofa and tucked her feet under herself in the way she did when she was tired, and Charlie turned the television off and gave the conversation the quiet it deserved. Tell me what happened, he said. From the beginning. She told him. The shopping with Jessica and Angela. The bookstore she had wanted to find, getting turned around looking for it, ending up in the wrong part of town, the men who had followed her. She told it steadily, with the controlled consistency he had heard in her voice on the phone, and he listened the way he listened to statements, with his full attention distributed across both the content and the shape of what he was being told. And Edward, Charlie said, when she reached that part. How did he find you? Bella met his eyes. He was in town. He saw me heading in the wrong direction and followed to make sure I was okay. He followed you, Charlie said. He saw me, Bella said, with a slight correction in her tone that he noted without commenting on. He was worried. After the van thing, he sort of. She paused and appeared to be selecting her words. He keeps an eye out. Charlie was quiet for a moment. He keeps an eye out, he repeated, not as a challenge, but as a thing he was examining. Dad. Bella's voice was patient, but contained something underneath the patience. A plea for him not to make this into something she would have to defend against. He helped me. Those men were not good, and he got me out of there and made sure I ate something and called you himself, because he knew you would want to know. That's not something to be suspicious about. I'm not suspicious, Charlie said, which was approximately true in the sense that he did not have anything specific to be suspicious of. I'm trying to understand. What is there to understand? He helped me. He's been helping me. The phrase landed quietly in the room between them, and Bella appeared to recognize immediately that she had given him more than she had intended to. He watched her absorb that recognition. He did not press on it. All right, Charlie said. I'm glad you're home. I'm glad you're not hurt. And I want you to know that if something like that happens again, if you're ever in a situation where you're not safe, I want to be the first call, not. He stopped. I appreciate that he called me. That was the right thing to do. But you call me first, okay? Okay, Bella said, and he believed her. She went upstairs not long after, and Charlie sat alone with the quiet and the off television and the question of a boy who kept an eye out for his daughter in ways that exceeded the normal territory of a school acquaintance. He thought about Billy's visit, about long memories and the kind of knowing that did not come with a paper trail. He thought about the way Bella had said he's been helping me. The plural implied in the present continuous tense, the suggestion of a pattern rather than a single incident. Harry Clearwater had said something in passing during their phone call earlier that Charlie found himself returning to now. Harry had mentioned, with the casual offhandedness of someone not attaching particular weight to what they were saying, that his cousin down at La Push had been talking about strange things in the forest lately. Animals behaving oddly, tracks that the hunters on the reservation did not recognize. Harry had said it, the way people in small communities mentioned local strangeness, as information rather than alarm, as one detail in the general texture of a place's life. Charlie filed it alongside everything else, He had a considerable number of filed observations by now, a quiet accumulating collection of things that individually explained themselves and collectively formed a shape he could not yet identify, but could not stop noticing. He was not frightened. He was not even certain he was worried in any way he could justify out loud. He was simply a father who paid attention, living in a small town where something beneath the surface of ordinary life was exerting a pressure he could feel without being able to locate, watching his daughter move toward the center of whatever that pressure was. He got up and turned off the lights and went upstairs. Outside, the rain came down over Forks in the steady, indifferent way it always did, over the dark forest and the quiet streets and the Swan house at the edge of town, where a light was still on in Bella's room, and Charlie Swan walked past her closed door and paused for just a moment listening, before continuing on to his own room and closing the door behind him. He was a patient man. He would keep watching. He would keep filing things away, and he would be there, ready and present and unconditional for whatever it was that was coming. That was all a father could do. It had to be enough. Edward Cullen began appearing at the house with a regularity that Charlie had not entirely anticipated, though he recognized afterward that he should have. The signs had been there in sufficient number. The quality of Bella's distraction, the Port Angeles phone call, the careful way she talked about the boy when she talked about him at all, which was less than the actual proportion of her thoughts he clearly occupied. Charlie had been paying attention to all of it. He simply had not fully projected forward to the practical consequence of it, which was a 17-year-old boy in his living room on a Wednesday evening, sitting on the sofa with a particular composed stillness that Charlie was beginning to understand, was simply how Edward Cullen existed in spaces. The first proper visit had happened without much preamble. Bella had mentioned the evening before that Edward might come by to help her with a school project. Charlie had said that was fine in the tone he used when something was fine provisionally and subject to observation. Edward had arrived at 7, knocked on the door with a courtesy that Charlie noted, and stood on the porch in the Forks rain without appearing to notice it or be particularly bothered by it in the way that a person standing in the rain was ordinarily bothered. His jacket was not heavy enough for the temperature. He did not appear to register this either. Charlie had opened the door and they had looked at each other for the first time with the direct attention of two people who understood they were taking each other's measure. "Chief Swan," Edward said, "thank you for having me. I appreciate it." "Come in," Charlie said, and stepped back to allow it. He had expected the same impression he had carried from the parking lot, the unnatural composure, the beauty that was slightly too symmetrical to feel entirely comfortable. Both of those things were present and confirmed. What he had not expected was the directness. Edward looked at him when he spoke and listened carefully when Charlie spoke in return, with the quality of attention that most adults did not consistently manage and that teenagers almost universally did not bother with. He answered Charlie's opening questions completely and without visible discomfort, and then asked a question of his own about the fishing trips he had heard Bella mention, and appeared to genuinely mean it. He asked a follow-up question when Charlie answered, which was the detail that surprised Charlie most. Most people ask polite questions and stop listening the moment the answer began. Edward did not do that. It was disarming in a way Charlie had not prepared for, and he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge it. Bella appeared from the kitchen, and the dynamic shifted in the way dynamics shifted when the person, two other people, were both oriented toward entered the room. Charlie watched Edward's face in the moment Bella came in. He had interviewed a great many people over the years in a great many different circumstances, and he had learned that the unguarded face, the face in the half second before a person remembers to manage it, told things the managed face did not. What he saw in Edward's expression in that fraction before the boy composed himself was something Charlie recognized, even if he wished he did not, because recognizing it made the situation considerably more complicated than he had been hoping it would be. The boy was not casually interested in his daughter. He was not engaged in the ordinary low-stakes social performance of a teenager pursuing a teenage infatuation. Whatever Edward Cullen felt when Bella walked into a room was not casual, and it was not low stakes. And Charlie Swan, who had felt something like it himself once, a very long time ago in circumstances that had not ended well, knew the difference between the surface version and the real one. He excused himself after a few minutes and went to sit in the kitchen under the pretense of paperwork, which allowed him to hear the general sound of conversation from the living room without being present in it. He was not eavesdropping. He was occupying his own house and could not help what carried through the walls. The conversation he could partially hear was ordinary enough. Something about a school assignment, a disagreement, about something that resolved itself in quiet laughter. The sound of Bella's laugh reaching him at the kitchen table with a warmth that sat alongside his unease without cancelling it. She was happy. That much was audible and unambiguous. The visits continued across the following weeks, and Charlie adjusted to them with the pragmatic acceptance of a man who understood that his daughter was 17, and that 17-year-olds formed attachments, and that his role in this process was to be present and watchful without being obstructive. He was aware that the line between the last two things was not always obvious, and that he was not naturally gifted at navigating it. He erred on the side of present rather than intrusive, and hoped the calibration was close enough. Edward was always polite, always appropriate in the ways that were visible to parental observation, always gone before 10 o'clock without needing to be asked, always acknowledging Charlie directly when he arrived, and when he left rather than treating him as furniture to be navigated around. He said good evening and thank you, and once, when Charlie mentioned offhandedly that the kitchen tap had been dripping for 2 weeks and he had not gotten around to it, Edward asked if he could take a look at it and fix the thing in under 10 minutes with a competence that was entirely unnecessary, and that Charlie found he could not object to. He gave credit for each of these things while also being unable to entirely turn off the part of him that was still accumulating observations. The thing that Charlie kept returning to, in the quiet of the evenings after Bella had gone upstairs and the house had settled back into its familiar silence, was the question of what Edward Cullen was when nobody was watching him perform being a normal teenager. Because that was what it felt like, at a level Charlie could not entirely justify through evidence, but also could not dismiss. A performance, not dishonest exactly, not malicious, but careful in a way that went beyond ordinary social self-consciousness, careful in the way of someone who had learned to move through a particular environment without disturbing it, and who applied that learning consistently. even in small domestic moments that should have required no such effort. Charlie had been watching people for 20 years. He knew what careful looked like, and he knew the difference between a person who was careful because they were anxious and a person who was careful because they had decided to be. Edward was the second kind, and had been since the parking lot, and Charlie filed this away with everything else without knowing yet what to do with it. It was his visit to the hospital, entirely unrelated to any of this, that moved his assessment of the Cullen family in a new direction. He had gone in to follow up with a deputy who had taken a minor knock on the job, the routine administrative courtesy of a chief who kept track of his people. The follow-up was brief, and Charlie was heading back through the main corridor toward the exit when he encountered Carlisle Cullen, coming the other way between patient rooms, moving with the unhurried efficiency Charlie had observed in good doctors, the kind who were never rushing, but always exactly where they needed to be. Carlisle stopped when he saw him, and his expression was one of uncomplicated warmth rather than the slight wariness Charlie had been half expecting. "Chief Swan," he said, "I'm glad to see you. I've been meaning to reach out, and I confess I've been uncertain about the right way to do it. I wanted to thank you for being understanding about Edward's involvement in Bella's life. I imagine it has not always been easy to navigate." Charlie looked at him steadily. "It's been an adjustment," he said, which was honest without being hostile. "I understand completely," Carlisle said, "and I want you to know that whatever you've observed about my son's attachment to your daughter, his intentions are entirely honorable. I realize that sounds like something a parent says reflexively. I mean it as a factual statement. Edward is not careless with the people he cares about. He is, if anything, the opposite." Charlie considered this. "Bella seems happy," he said. "Whatever else I can say about the situation, I can say that." Something in Carlisle's face shifted at this, something that looked like genuine relief rather than performed gratitude. "That matters to us more than you might realize," he said. "She has been good for him as well, in ways I did not expect and that I am." He paused briefly, and Charlie had the impression of a man selecting words with precise care. "Grateful for. We are all rather fond of her, as a family. I hope you know that our home is open to you, Chief Swan. Not as a courtesy, but as a genuine offer. I think it might be useful for you to see for yourself how things are rather than receiving them second-hand through a 17-year-old girl who is doing her best to manage two worlds simultaneously." It was a direct and confident and entirely unexpected thing to say, and Charlie noted it carefully. People with serious things to hide did not extend open invitations to police chiefs. They managed their perimeter. They were friendly at a controlled distance. They did not suggest you come and see. "I might take you up on that," Charlie said, which was the most he was prepared to offer in a hospital corridor, but which he meant. They spoke for several minutes more. Carlisle asked about the vandalism at the trail head north of town, expressed what seemed like genuine interest in the community's life beyond the hospital. He asked after Harry Clearwater, whom he had treated the previous winter and whose health he described with the careful language of a doctor who took confidentiality seriously but wanted to convey that he was paying attention. When they parted ways, Charlie walked back to his cruiser with a slightly different internal weather than he had arrived with. Not certainty, nothing approaching certainty, but a revision, He did not have an explanation for most of what he had accumulated about the Cullen family, but Carlyle had looked him in the eye with complete steadiness and offered access rather than deflection, and that was not a small thing. Charlie had met men in his professional life who were genuinely dangerous, men who had done terrible things and who sat across tables from him and lied with the smooth consistency of people who had been lying for so long they had stopped noticing the effort it required. Carlyle Cullen did not have the quality of such men. He had something else entirely, something that Charlie's experience told him was either genuine decency or an imitation of it so complete as to be practically indistinguishable. And he had been doing this long enough to know that practically indistinguishable was sometimes the best you could get. Billy came by that weekend and the conversation found its way back to the territory it had been occupying for some weeks. They were on the back porch, despite the cold, the particular configuration Billy defaulted to when he had something he did not want contained by walls. Charlie brought the beers and sat down and let Billy arrive at it in his own time. "She's spending real time over there now," Billy said, "at the house. It's not just him coming here." "I know," Charlie said, "and you've met the father. Ran into him at the hospital." Billy was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark tree line where the yard ended and the forest began. "What did you make of him?" Charlie turned his bottle in his hands. "He's not what I expected," he said honestly. "I went in there expecting to feel the way I feel after every conversation I've had about that family, which is the feeling that something is there that I can't see. And I came out feeling," he paused, "less certain about that." "That's not an accident," Billy said, and his voice was not unkind, but it was firm. "Charlie, that family has been managing how people see them for a very long time, longer than you or I have been alive. What you felt in that conversation was what you were meant to feel. I am not saying Carlyle Cullen is a bad man. I am saying that the impression he makes and the reality of what he is are two different things, and the gap between them is not something you're going to find by talking to him in the hospital corridor." Charlie listened to this with full seriousness, which was what it deserved. Billy did not speak this way about things that were not real to him. "Then tell me what the reality is," Charlie said. "Give me something I can work with." Billy was quiet for a long time. The rain had started again, softer now, the kind of Forks rain. There was more mist than drops, settling on everything without sound. "My father's cousin is 93 years old," Billy said finally. "She remembers things that her grandmother told her, which means she carries memories that go back well over 100 years. The Cullen family is in those memories, Charlie. Not as rumor, as specific, detailed, witnessed knowledge passed down through the women of our tribe, because the women were the ones who paid attention. She told me what they are. She used the word that our tradition uses, which is not a word I'm going to say out here in the dark, but which means something specific and something old and something that does not belong in the life of your daughter." The back porch was very quiet. Charlie sat with this for a long moment, long enough that the silence between them became a full and considered thing, rather than an empty one. "I hear you," he said finally. "I hear everything you're telling me, Billy, and I'm not dismissing it. But what you are asking me to do is act on the testimony of a 93-year-old woman's childhood memory, of her grandmother's account of something that happened over a century ago, and apply it to a family that has done nothing in this town that I can point to and call wrong. I can't do that. Not as a policeman and not as a father who is trying not to ruin the first real happiness his daughter has found. Billy nodded slowly. Then watch, he said. That's all I'm asking. Just watch very carefully. That I can do, Charlie said. That I have been doing. They sat together in the damp dark until the cold became unreasonable, and then they went inside and finished their beers in the warmth of the kitchen, without speaking much more about it. Later, after Billy had gone, and Bella had come home and gone upstairs, and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Charlie stood at the kitchen window with his last cup of coffee and looked out at the tree line at the back of the yard, the dark edge where the forest began, and thought about long memories and the things they contained. He was watching. He would keep watching. That was the honest and complete extent of what he could promise to himself and to Billy and to the daughter upstairs, whose happiness he was not willing to dismantle without cause. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and the rain came down over Forks in its patient, unceasing way, and the forest stood dark and full of whatever it had always contained, and morning would come, and Charlie Swan would get up and make his coffee and go to work and keep his eyes open. That was what he had. It would have to be enough. The reports started coming in on a Wednesday in late March, and at first Charlie filed them in the category of things that had a straightforward explanation he had not yet identified. The first was a livestock report from a farm on the eastern edge of town. 2 sheep found dead in the field overnight, the farmer describing the scene in the flat, careful language of a man who had seen animal death before and knew the difference between the ordinary kind and something else. Charlie drove out himself, which was not strictly necessary, but was the kind of thing he did when something felt like it warranted his direct attention rather than a deputy's. He looked at the scene for a long time without speaking. Then he took photographs and measurements and drove back to the station and wrote a thorough report and sent a copy to the county wildlife office. The county wildlife office sent someone out the following week. The man they sent was competent and methodical, and he walked the property and examined the evidence and came back to Charlie's office and sat down across the desk with the expression of someone who had an answer they were not entirely comfortable with. Predator attack, he said. Large predator. Beyond that, I can't tell you with confidence. The attack pattern is not entirely consistent with anything I'd expect to find in this region. Mountain lion, Charlie offered. Possibly, the wildlife officer said, in a tone that conveyed it was not possibly. More reports came in over the following 2 weeks. A hiker who had been on a trail north of town had encountered something in the tree line that he described with the embarrassed imprecision of a man who knew his account was going to sound unreliable and who was reporting it anyway because he felt he should. Large, fast, not a bear, he was fairly certain, though he could not say with confidence what it was instead. He had not been hurt. He had left the trail and driven back to town and had not returned to that particular area. Charlie logged the report without comment and added it to the folder on his desk that was growing in a way he did not love. A second livestock incident, this one on a property further north and west, near the edge of the Olympic National Forest boundary. A third report, this one from a deer hunter who had found a carcass in a clearing that he found disturbing enough to photograph and bring to the station. Charlie looked at the photographs for a long time. He sent them to the wildlife office. He sent copies to the State Department as well, because he was a thorough man and because the accumulation of incidents had crossed the threshold where thoroughness felt like it might matter. The wildlife experts continued to be puzzled. That was the word one of them used in an email response, puzzled, and Charlie read it and appreciated the honesty of it, even while finding it insufficient. He was also puzzled. The difference was that his puzzlement was accompanied by the specific background anxiety of a man responsible for the safety of a community, and puzzled was not a satisfactory operational condition for a police chief. He organized a search of the areas where the incidents had been reported, taking 2 of his deputies and coordinating with the park rangers who managed the adjoining forest land. They covered the relevant ground over 2 days and found things that confirmed the presence of a large animal operating in the area, and nothing that told him clearly what the animal was or where it was currently located. He posted notices at the trailheads. He contacted the high school and asked them to communicate to students that the trails north of town were currently under a precautionary advisory. He did his job systematically and without drama, and went home each evening with the folder on his desk heavier than it had been the day before. Bella was aware that something was occupying him professionally. She noticed things, his daughter, and she had learned enough of his rhythms over the months of living together to read the particular quality of his distraction when something at work was sitting unresolved at the back of his mind. She asked about it one evening over dinner, carefully, in the way she asked about things she was genuinely curious about rather than making conversation. "There have been some animal incidents north of town," Charlie said. "Nothing to worry about. I'd just prefer you stay on the main roads for a while. Don't go into the forest, trails." Bella's expression was attentive in a way that he could not entirely read. "What kind of animal?" she asked. "That's what we're still determining," Charlie said. "Until we know more, just stay clear of the trails, all right?" "All right," Bella said, and he believed her, and they moved on to other topics, and Charlie did not examine too closely the slight quality of something withheld that he had seen in her face in the moment before she agreed. The weeks that followed held an uneasy double texture for Charlie, the professional concern of the animal incidents running alongside the domestic adjustment of watching his daughter's relationship with Edward Cullen deepen past the point where he could reasonably classify it as a school friendship with complications. Edward was at the house most evenings now. Bella spent time at the Cullen house on the weekends. The 2 of them had developed the particular gravitational pull toward each other that Charlie recognized as the real thing, rather than its approximation, and he had made a kind of peace with this even while continuing to watch. He had taken Carlyle up on the offer to visit once on a Saturday afternoon when Bella was already there. He had driven out along the forest road to the Cullen house, which appeared through the trees with a gradual revelation that was more architecture than Charlie had expected. All pale wood and glass, the kind of house that made Forks look like it was located somewhere considerably more sophisticated than it was. Esme Cullen had answered the door and welcomed him with a warmth that seemed genuine, in the way Carlyle's directness had seemed genuine. Neither performed nor excessive, simply present. He had stayed for an hour and a half. He had spoken with Carlyle and with Emmett, the large, cheerful one who filled a room with good-natured energy, and briefly with Alice, who was small and bright-eyed, and who looked at Charlie with an attention that he found mildly disconcerting, without being able to say exactly why. Rosalie had been polite at a careful distance. Jasper had been quiet in a corner in a way that Charlie's instincts registered as watchful rather than merely introverted. He had come away from the visit with the same revision that the hospital corridor had produced. Not certainty, not comfort exactly, but a recalibration. These were not, by any observable metric, dangerous people. They were unusual people. Unusual in ways Charlie could not catalogue completely. But the house had been warm and welcoming, and Bella had been visibly happy in it. And Carlyle had walked him to his car and shaken his hand, and told him that his presence was always welcome, and had looked like he meant it. Billy had not been pleased to hear about the visit. His response, when Charlie mentioned it the following weekend, was the careful, measured displeasure of a man who had said his piece and understood it had not landed where he needed it to land, and who was deciding whether to say it again differently or accept the limitation. "The animal incidents are connected to them, Charlie," Billy said. "They were fishing, or attempting to fish, the rain having made the river higher than ideal, and the fish less cooperative than usual. I need you to understand that." Charlie kept his eyes on the water. "You need to give me something I can use, Billy. I mean it. I'm not dismissing you, but I cannot go to a family that has been nothing but cooperative and courteous and tell them I'm investigating them based on what you're telling me. I need something concrete." "The Quileute boys have been patrolling," Billy said, which was the most specific thing he had said in any of their conversations on this subject, and Charlie looked at him directly. "Patrolling for what?" Charlie said. Billy was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was choosing rather than hesitating. "For the things that are making those incidents," he said finally. "And they're not finding what you think they're finding, Charlie. They're finding something else. Something the Wildlife Office is never going to be able to classify because it doesn't appear in their field guides." Charlie sat with this. The river moved past them, and the rain came down, and somewhere in the forest to the east, something had been killing livestock in ways that puzzled the county's most experienced wildlife officer. "Are your boys safe?" Charlie said. "Whatever they're doing out there, are they safe?" Something crossed Billy's face at that. Something complicated that resolved itself into a kind of pride that Charlie could not fully interpret. "They can handle themselves," Billy said. "Better than you might expect." Charlie went back to his fishing and said nothing more about it. And they sat in the rain for another hour and caught nothing worth keeping, and drove home separately with the conversation between them like a weight neither of them had put down. The night that Bella came home from the supposed Cullen family outing with Alice and Jasper instead of Edward began like a number of other Sunday evenings had begun. Charlie in his chair, the game on, the comfortable repetition of a weekend night winding down. He had known Bella was with the Cullens. She had told him they were doing something outdoors, which he had accepted with the equanimity he had developed around the Cullen family's various activities, most of which seemed to involve the forest, and none of which had produced anything he needed to intervene in. The front door opened, and it was Alice and Jasper, and Bella was between them. and Charlie sat forward in his chair before he had consciously decided to. Bella looked frightened. She was containing it, doing a creditable job of containing it, but Charlie had been watching his daughter's face for months now with the close attention of someone learning a language, and frightened was what he read beneath the composed surface she was presenting. Her eyes were slightly too bright. The set of her jaw was slightly too controlled. She was performing calm the way people perform calm, when calm was the opposite of what they were feeling. "Hey Dad," she said. "Change of plans. I think I'm going to go visit Mum for a while." Charlie turned off the television. He did this slowly, deliberately, giving himself a moment and giving her a moment. "Tonight," he said. "Soon," Bella said. I miss her. It's been a while." He looked at Alice, who met his eyes with an expression that was warm and entirely uninformative. He looked at Jasper, who was standing slightly behind and to the side of Bella, in a position that Charlie's body recognition read, without being able to justify the reading, as protective rather than casual. He looked back at his daughter. "What happened?" Charlie said. "Nothing happened," Bella said. "I just want to see my mum." There were tears in her eyes. She was working hard to keep them from going further than that, and the effort of it was visible to him in the slight tension around her eyes and the careful control of her breathing. Charlie Swan was not the man who needed his daughter to be in tears to take her distress seriously, but seeing it there, held back with such determination, produced a feeling in him that overrode the policeman's instinct to press for information. She was scared. She needed to go. Whatever had happened in that forest, or at that house, or wherever the evening had taken a wrong turn, she needed to not be in Forks right now, and she was asking him to let her go without making her explain why. And Charlie sat with the impossible calculus of that for a long moment. "Have you called your mom?" he said finally. "Not yet." "Call her now," he said. "Make sure she's expecting you. And then tell me what flight you're looking at, and I'll help you find it." The relief on Bella's face was immediate and genuine, and so large that it confirmed everything he had already concluded. Whatever this was, it was serious, and she was not able to tell him. And the best thing he could do for her in this moment was let her go, rather than trap her in a house and a conversation she was not safe to have. He helped her pack. He found flights on his laptop, while she pulled clothes from her closet. Alice perched on the edge of the bed, with a stillness that Charlie noticed peripherally. Jasper waiting in the hallway outside with the same watchful quiet as before. Charlie booked the ticket and printed the confirmation and drove Bella to the airport in Port Angeles through the dark and the rain, without pushing her for answers she was not going to give him. At the departure's entrance, he got out of the car and hugged her, which was not a thing they did often, and which mattered because of that. She held on for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and he let her, his hand on the back of her head, his daughter, who was frightened and going away from him, and who he could not protect from whatever had frightened her, because she would not let him see it. "You call me when you land," he said. "I will," she said, "and you call me if anything." He stopped. "Just call me. Whatever it is, call me." She nodded against his shoulder. Then she pulled back and picked up her bag and went through the doors, and Charlie stood in the rain outside the departure's entrance and watched her go, and felt the particular helplessness of a parent whose child has just carried something he could not carry for her into a set of sliding glass doors that closed between them. He drove back to Forks alone through the dark, and the forest pressed in on both sides of the road, and somewhere in it something had been moving that the wildlife office could not classify, and his daughter was on her way to Phoenix, and Billy Black's voice was in his head saying, "They're finding something else." And Charlie drove and said nothing to no one and kept his hand steady on the wheel. He was a patient man. He had always been a patient man. But patience, he was learning, had a cost that was not always visible until it came due. Charlie had been a policeman long enough to know that the worst calls were not the ones that came in loud and urgent. The ones that arrived with sirens already implied in the dispatcher's voice. The worst calls were the quiet ones. The ones delivered in a tone that was trying to stay level. Those were the ones that meant something had already happened and could not be undampened. And the only question remaining was how bad the accounting was going to be. Renee's voice on the phone was that kind of quiet. She called on a Tuesday evening, and Charlie knew before she had finished her second sentence that something was wrong in a way that exceeded the ordinary category of parental concern. Bella was in the hospital. She'd been hurt. She was going to be all right, Renee said, and said it again immediately in the way people repeated the most important information when they were not entirely certain they believed it themselves. She was going to be all right. But Charlie needed to come. He was on a flight to Phoenix before 10 o'clock that night. He had packed the bag on autopilot, the practical machinery of a man who knew how to move quickly when moving quickly was required, and he had driven to the airport in Port Angeles with a particular focused emptiness that descended on him in genuine emergencies, the state in which feeling was set aside in favor of function, because function was what the situation required, and feeling could be attended to later. He had called the station from the car and left instructions with his deputy. He had called Billy briefly and said only that there was a family matter and he would be in touch. Billy had asked no questions, which was one of the things Charlie valued most about him. On the plane, he sat in the window seat and looked at the dark below and thought about Bella the way he thought about her when he allowed himself to think about her fully, without the editing he applied in daily life to keep the size of it manageable. She was his daughter. She had come back to him after years of careful distance and had filled his quiet house with her presence in ways he had not anticipated and had not known he needed. He had been getting to know her again, the real version of her, the person she had become in the years he had not been there for in the way he should have been. And he had found her to be someone he liked as well as loved, which was not a thing he had taken for granted. The thought of her hurt, of her in a hospital in a city that was not his, without him there, produced a feeling he did not have a useful word for. He looked at the dark below the plane and kept his hand still in his lap, and breathed steadily and waited to land. The hospital in Phoenix was large and fluorescent, and full of the particular organized chaos of a busy urban medical center, which was entirely unlike Forks General, and which Charlie navigated with the directional instinct of a man who had spent time in institutional buildings of various kinds and knew how to read the logic of them. He found the right floor, the right corridor, and then he found Renee, standing outside a room with her hands clasped in front of her and her face carrying the residue of several hours of fear that was only beginning to process itself into something less acute. They had never been good at being in the same space since the divorce, not because there was hostility between them exactly, but because there was the memory of what had not worked, which occupied its own uncomfortable territory. None of that mattered tonight. Charlie put his hand briefly on Renee's shoulder, and she leaned into it for a moment, and they stood together outside their daughter's room in the uncomplicated solidarity of two people who disagreed about most things and agreed completely about this one. "She's sleeping," Renee said. "They gave her something for the pain. Her leg is broken, a bad break. She'll need surgery tomorrow morning. There's a concussion. There are lacerations on her hands." She paused. "They said she fell down a flight of stairs and through a window." Charlie looked at her. "Did they?" "That's what she told them," Renee said. "That's what she told me." He went into the room and sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at his daughter for a long time without speaking. She was pale against the hospital pillow, her dark hair pushed back from her face, one hand bandaged to the wrist, the other lying open on the blanket. The monitoring equipment beside the bed provided a quiet rhythm of confirmation. She was here. She was breathing. Her heart was doing what hearts were supposed to do. He sat with that for a while before he started thinking about anything else. Then he started thinking about everything else. He had been a policeman for 20 years, and he had attended scenes involving falls. He knew what injuries from falls looked like, knew their general pattern and distribution, knew the typical story that a body told when it had encountered stairs and gravity and the edge of something sharp. He sat beside his daughter's hospital bed and looked at the shape of her injuries as Renee had described them and as he could partially observe them. And the story they told did not sit cleanly inside the explanation he had been given. A fall downstairs accounted for some of it. A fall through a window accounted for some of the laceration pattern. Together, they produced an explanation that was not impossible. But there were details in the arrangement of things that raised questions a policeman could not entirely silence. Questions about force and direction and the particular distribution of damage across a body that had allegedly fallen rather than been struck. He sat with these questions and did not speak them aloud because his daughter was asleep and his former wife was in the doorway, and neither of these things was the right context for what would essentially be treating his injured child as a crime scene. He stayed with Bella through the night, dozing occasionally in the chair, waking each time the nursing staff came in to check her vitals. In those quiet intervals between checks, he sat in the low light of the hospital room and listened to the sounds of the building around him and thought, Edward Cullen was here. That had been the first thing Renee had told him after the basic medical summary, that the Cullen boy had come with Bella, that he had been at the hospital since she arrived, that Bella had asked for him specifically when she was conscious enough to ask for things. Charlie had not yet seen him. He was presumably somewhere in the building, in a waiting room, maintaining the vigil that Bella had apparently asked him to maintain. Charlie thought about the Sunday evening when Bella had told him she needed to visit her mother, the sudden decision, the red eyes she had been working to hide, the explanation that had been delivered with the smooth consistency of something rehearsed. He thought about Alice and Jasper Cullen driving his daughter to the airport, which was a detail he had not examined closely enough at the time, because he had been too focused on Bella's distress and his own helplessness in the face of it. He thought about the animal attack reports that had been accumulating in his files over the past several weeks. The wildlife experts who had gone away puzzled, the pattern that did not match any known predator. He thought about all of it in the way he thought about open cases, turning the pieces over, looking at the edges, trying to find the shape of the thing that connected them. He could not find it. Every time he approached something that felt like an answer, it dissolved into the category of things that were suggestive but not conclusive, that raised questions without providing the kind of evidence a responsible person acted on. He was not a man who invented narratives and then looked for facts to fit them. He was a man who gathered facts and waited for the narrative to emerge from them. The facts he had were insufficient. The narrative had not emerged. What had emerged clearly and without ambiguity was that his daughter had been in serious danger, was now in a hospital bed, and had been in the company of the Cullen family when both of those things happened. Renee came back in the early morning, and they sat together for a while and drank the bad hospital coffee and talked about logistics, the surgery, the recovery timeline, the question of whether Bella would come back to Phoenix for a while to recuperate. Renee wanted her close. Charlie understood this completely. He also knew, without having discussed it with anyone, that Bella was going to want to go back to Forks, and that Bella wanting something with a particular quiet determination she brought to the thing she genuinely wanted was a force that was difficult to redirect. "What do you think actually happened?" Renee said eventually, in the careful voice of a woman who'd been sitting with the same question Charlie had been sitting with, and who wanted to know if they were sitting with the same version of it. Charlie looked at his coffee cup. "I think she was in some kind of trouble," he said. "I think the Cullen family was involved in getting her out of it. And I think the story we've been given is the story she wants us to have." "Should we push her?" Renee asked. Charlie was quiet for a moment. "She's going to be 18 in September," he said. "We can push. But if she's decided not to tell us something, she's not going to tell us. And pushing might close a door we need to keep open." Renee nodded slowly, not entirely satisfied, which was accurate to how he felt himself. Bella woke in the late morning, and the first thing she did after confirming that both her parents were present was ask about Edward. Charlie watched her face when they told her he was in the building, and saw the specific quality of relief that crossed it, and added that observation to everything else he was carrying. He sat beside her bed when she was fully awake and asked her gently and without pressure to tell him what had happened. She told him the full story with the consistent detail of someone who had been over it enough times to have it said. And Charlie listened to it the way he listened to everything, with his full attention on both the content and the shape of it. He asked a few questions, not the sharp questions he would have asked in a professional context, but careful ones, the questions of a father who was trying to understand, rather than a policeman who was trying to catch someone out. Her answers were consistent. They were almost too consistent, in the way that stories become too consistent when they have been prepared, rather than simply remembered. But he had nothing he could press on specifically, and she was injured and tired and had been frightened badly enough that her eyes still carried the residue of it, even through the careful composure she was maintaining. "Bella," he said finally, when the questions had reached their natural end, "if you were in trouble, real trouble, you would tell me, wouldn't you?" She looked at him with those eyes that he had spent months learning to read, and that still gave him less than he needed. "The worst is over, Dad," she said. "I promise you that." It was not an answer to the question he had asked. He noted this and accepted it, and squeezed her bandaged hand very gently and told her he was glad she was going to be all right, because he was, completely and above everything else, glad she was going to be all right. Edward came in that afternoon briefly, while Charlie was present. He sat on the other side of Bella's bed and spoke to her quietly, and looked at Charlie once with an expression that Charlie read after a moment as something between accountability and apology. Not guilt exactly. Something more complicated than guilt. The expression of a person who understood that something had gone wrong and that someone else had paid the price of it, and who was carrying that knowledge without the option of setting it down. Charlie looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at his daughter, at the relief on her face with Edward in the room, at the way the tension she had been holding since she woke seemed to ease by several degrees simply because this boy was present. He did not say anything to Edward, not that afternoon. There would be time for that conversation later, and this was not the right room or the right moment for it. He simply sat with both of them in the pale phoenix afternoon, the light very different from Falk's light, too bright and too certain, and held the things he knew and the things he didn't, and loved his daughter as plainly and completely as he knew how. Bella came home on a Thursday afternoon in early May, and Charlie drove to Port Angeles to collect her with the particular focused anticipation of a man who had spent 2 weeks in a house that had revealed, through her absence, exactly how much it had changed since January. He had not fully understood, until she was gone, how thoroughly she had altered the texture of his daily life. It was not loud, her presence. It had never been loud, but it was consistent. And consistent was the thing Charlie valued most in the architecture of a life. And without it, the house had reverted to a silence that was different in quality from the silence before she arrived. Before, the silence had been simply the condition of the place, neutral and unremarkable. Now, it was an absence, which was a different thing entirely, and he had moved through it for 2 weeks with the awareness of someone navigating around furniture that had been removed without warning. He had kept himself occupied, which was not difficult because work had provided sufficient occupation on its own. The animal incident files were still open, the wildlife office still officially puzzled, though in the days following Bella's departure, the reports had stopped arriving with the same frequency. 2 weeks of relative quiet on that front. Charlie noted this without drawing conclusions from it, because drawing conclusions from an absence of evidence was not sound practice. But he noted it. He had spoken to Bella every day by phone, brief calls, the Swan family version of daily contact, which was characterized more by the fact of the call than its content. She had sounded tired, and then less tired, and then, in the last few days before she came home, like herself again, in a way that had eased something in his chest considerably. She had not told him anything more than she had told him the night she left. He had not pushed. The door, as he had told Renee, needed to stay open. She came through the arrivals area on crutches, which he had known about from the phone calls, but which landed differently in person, the physical reality of her injury more present than it had been as information. She was pale and moved carefully, and there was something around her eyes that spoke of the kind of tired that sleep did not entirely resolve. But she was upright, and she was here, and when she saw him she produced a smile that was genuine rather than performed. And Charlie took her bag from her shoulder and held the door and did not say anything that needed saying in an airport. The drive back to Forks was quiet in the comfortable way rather than the loaded way, both of them settling back into the familiar rhythm of each other's company. Bella looked out the window at the rain and the green pressing in from both sides of the road, and Charlie watched her in his peripheral vision and saw her shoulders drop by a fraction as they crossed back into Forks proper. The involuntary release of a person arriving somewhere they had decided, without perhaps fully articulating it, was home. "It's good to be back," she said, which was the most she offered, and which was enough. He had prepared for her return with the same practical attention he had brought to preparing her room in January, which was his way of expressing things he could not say directly. He had bought the specific brand of cereal she ate and the juice she preferred, and had cleaned the house with a thoroughness that went beyond his usual standard. He had moved the furniture in the living room slightly to create a clearer path between the sofa and the kitchen, thinking about the crutches, and then had moved it back because it looked wrong and she was capable of navigating around furniture, and then had moved it again in a more subtle configuration that he hoped was helpful without being obvious about being helpful. She noticed. He could tell from the way she looked at the room when she came in, the slight pause that meant she was registering a change, and then the way she looked at him without saying anything. He did not acknowledge it. She did not either. That was, he had come to understand, one of the dialects of their particular relationship. The first days of her recovery settled into a rhythm that Charlie found in a way he had not expected, among the better days he had spent in that house. He was home more than usual, arranging his schedule with a flexibility his deputies found slightly surprising, because Bella was on crutches and the house was not designed for crutches, and he wanted to be available without making a production of being available. He cooked dinner each evening with the workman-like consistency that was the ceiling of his culinary ability, and she sat at the kitchen table and kept him company while he did it, and they talked about small things, the town, the station, a book she was reading, a fishing story he had told before, but told again because she had not complained about it the first time. It was in these kitchen evenings, quiet and unhurried, that Charlie felt the distance between them closing in the way it had been closing since January, but faster now, as if the Phoenix trip had removed some last formality between them that had been too polite to dismantle directly. She was easier with him. He was easier with her. The careful navigation they had been doing around each other since she arrived was not gone, but it had become less effortful, more natural, the map of each other more familiar underfoot. Edward came on the second day after her return. Charlie had expected this and had prepared himself for the conversation he had decided on the long drive back from Port Angeles 2 weeks ago that he was going to have. He answered the door, and Edward was on the porch in the rain, which was where Edward Cullen always seemed to be when Charlie opened the door patient and composed, and apparently indifferent to weather. Charlie looked at him for a moment, and Edward looked back at him, and something in the boy's expression confirmed what Charlie had read in the hospital in Phoenix: accountability. The awareness of someone who understood that a cost had been paid and who was not going to pretend otherwise. "Come in," Charlie said. Then, before Edward could move past him, "We're going to talk first, before you see her." Edward stopped. "Yes, sir," he said. "Of course." They sat in the living room, Charlie in his chair, Edward on the sofa, and Charlie took a moment to look at the boy with the full and unhurried attention he'd been applying to him in fragments for months. Edward sat with his characteristic stillness, his hands loose in his lap, his eyes on Charlie directly. He was not nervous, or if he was, it did not produce any of the physical evidence nervousness usually produced in people being looked at by a police chief who had indicated he wanted to talk. "I'm not going to ask you to tell me what actually happened in Phoenix," Charlie said. "Bella's made her position on that clear, and I respect it. But I want you to hear something from me directly." He paused, making sure he had the words in the right order, which mattered to him. "Whatever happened, she got hurt. She got hurt badly. And I need to know, not as the police chief, but as her father, that you understand the weight of that, and that you're going to make sure it doesn't happen again." Edward was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful and unhurried, in the way that Charlie had come to recognize as the boy's genuine register rather than a managed one. "I understand it completely," he said, "more than I can properly explain to you. What happened should not have happened. Keeping her safe is not something I take lightly, Chief Swan. It is a thing I take most seriously." Charlie looked at him. He was listening not just to the words, but to the architecture beneath the words, the thing that told you whether a statement was constructed or simply true. What he heard was the second thing. "All right," he said. Then, "She's in her room. You know the way." Edward stood. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me be here. I know it isn't uncomplicated for you." "It isn't," Charlie agreed. "But she needs you here. That's what matters to me." He went back to his chair after Edward had gone upstairs and turned the television on at a volume that was really just sound to think alongside, and sat with the conversation for a while. He had said what he needed to say, and he had been heard, and Edward had said what he said, and Charlie had believed it in the way he believed things that passed through the particular filter he had developed over 20 years of listening to people tell him things. The filter was not perfect. Nothing was perfect, but it was what he had. Carlisle came by on a Thursday evening the following week, which surprised Charlie because it was unannounced, though not in a way that felt presumptuous. He came to the door without the boy, alone, and asked if Charlie had a few minutes. Charlie put the coffee on and they sat at the kitchen table. Carlisle asked about Bella's recovery with the specific clinical interest of a doctor checking in, asking questions about the healing rate of the leg, her sleep, her appetite, her energy levels. Charlie answered what he could and admitted what he did not know with the directness he brought to such admissions. And Carlisle listened and nodded and offered a few observations that were gentle and useful and clearly based on an attention to Bella's well-being that had been operating for some time. Then Carlisle set his coffee cup down and looked at Charlie with the particular directness Charlie had come to expect from him. "I want to apologize to you," he said. "Not on behalf of Edward specifically, because he will do that himself and has likely already done it, but on behalf of my family. Bella came into contact with something dangerous because of her connection to us. That is a debt we take seriously." Charlie looked at him. "What was it?" he said. "What she came into contact with." Carlyle held his gaze. "Individuals who meant her harm," he said. "They are no longer a concern. I want you to be able to believe that as a fact, not as a reassurance. They are no longer in a position to be a concern to anyone." Charlie sat with this for a long time. There was more in what Carlyle had not said than in what he had, and Charlie understood this and accepted it in the way he had accepted many things about this family, as the shape of an answer rather than the answer itself. "Is she safe now?" he said. "Here, in Forks." "Yes," Carlyle said, with a particular quality of certainty that did not feel like performance. "She is safe." Charlie nodded. He picked up his coffee cup. "You want to stay for dinner?" he said. "I made too much chili." Something crossed Carlyle's face at that, a warmth that arrived unexpectedly and that seemed to catch even him slightly off guard. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate that more than you might know. I have to get back, but thank you, Charlie." The use of his first name registered. He let it register without comment. After Carlyle had gone, Charlie stood at the kitchen counter for a while, thinking about the conversation, turning it over with the habit of a mind that did not release things until it had examined them fully. Individuals who meant her harm, they are no longer a concern. He had been a policeman for 20 years, and he understood that those sentences, delivered in that way by that man, were not imprecise. They were exact, and what they described was something that had happened in Phoenix, in the vicinity of his daughter, something that the official record described as a fall down a flight of stairs, something that was over now in a way that was apparently permanent. He was aware that he was choosing, consciously and with full knowledge, that it was a choice not to pursue what he could have pursued. He was aware that a more rigorous application of his professional obligations might look different from what he was doing. But he was also a father, and his daughter was upstairs on the mend, and the boy who apparently loved her was sitting up there with her, and the man who led that family had sat in his kitchen and looked him in the eye and told him she was safe. He had spent months accumulating things he could not see clearly enough to act on. He was tired of not being able to see clearly, and perhaps seeing clearly, he was beginning to understand, was not always available to a person. Perhaps sometimes you had to decide what you trusted and act from that instead. He trusted that Bella was safe. He trusted that the Cullens, whatever they were, had chosen her as part of something they would protect. He trusted Carlyle Cullen's eyes when they told him the threat was gone. He served himself the chili and ate it at the kitchen table and listened to the quiet sounds of his daughter's voice upstairs, the low murmur of two people talking, and the rain on the roof, and the scanner on the counter, and the house around him full of its ordinary and reliable life. It was enough. For tonight, it was more than enough. The prom preparations began in a way that Charlie had not anticipated and could not have adequately prepared for, which was Alice Cullen arriving at the front door on a Saturday morning 3 weeks before the event with the particular focused energy of someone who had decided something and was now in the process of executing it. Charlie answered the door in his Saturday clothes, coffee in hand, and found her standing on the porch with a brightness in her expression that reminded him, incongruously, of a general who had completed the planning phase and was ready to begin the campaign. She asked if Bella was available. She was always perfectly polite, this one. Charlie had noticed that about her from the first visit, the impeccable social courtesy that existed alongside the quality he could never quite name, the thing all the Cullens had, to varying degrees, the sense of someone operating on more than one level simultaneously. He let her in and called upstairs and poured himself a second coffee and retreated to the kitchen, where he could hear the conversation that developed without being present in it. Alice's voice was clear and decisive. Bella's was resistant in the way that Bella was resistant to things she was going to capitulate on eventually. A resistance that was real but provisional. Within 20 minutes, the conversation had shifted from negotiation to planning, and Charlie sat at his kitchen table with his coffee and his Saturday paperwork and allowed himself a small private amusement at the thoroughness with which Alice Cullen had managed his daughter. They went shopping the following weekend, Bella and Alice, to Port Angeles. Charlie had expressed no objections and had offered, somewhat awkwardly, to contribute to whatever dress was selected, producing his wallet with the specific self-consciousness of a man who understood he was operating in territory that was not his natural habitat. Bella had looked at him with an expression that was equal parts fondness and practicality, and had told him that Alice was handling it. Charlie had put his wallet away with something that felt very much like relief and had gone back to his coffee. He heard about the dress second-hand from Bella, who described it with the careful understatement of someone who liked something more than they were going to admit directly. Blue, simple, not the kind of thing that required a lot of explanation. Charlie nodded and said it sounded nice and meant it in the way he meant most things, simply and without elaboration. The week before prom, Charlie found himself doing something he hadn't done since Bella was very small, which was thinking deliberately about what he wanted to say to her and how. He was not a man who prepared speeches. He was not a man who prepared much of anything verbal, preferring to let conversation arrive organically and deal with whatever it brought. But there was something about the prom, about the particular passage it represented, that made him want to be intentional in a way he was not always capable of being. He was not going to say most of what he was thinking. That was a given. He was not going to tell her that watching her move through this year, watching her find her footing in Forks and in his house and in whatever the Cullens were to her, had been one of the better experiences of his adult life. He was not going to tell her that the house in January, before she arrived, had been a kind of loneliness he had not fully recognized as loneliness until she had arrived and named it by contrast. He was not going to say any of that directly, but he was going to be present. He was going to take the photographs and ask the questions and stand on the porch in the Forks rain and be her father in every visible and concrete way available to him. And he was going to trust that she understood what that meant. The evening arrived grey and cool, which was the only kind of evening Forks reliably produced. Charlie showered and changed into a clean shirt, which was his version of dressing for an occasion. and went downstairs to wait. He had positioned himself in the living room with what he hoped was the appearance of a man who was simply sitting, rather than a man who was waiting with the attentiveness of someone who had been thinking about this evening for a week. Edward knocked at 7 o'clock precisely. Charlie opened the door and looked at him. The boy was in a dark suit, which he wore with the ease of someone to whom formal clothes were not a novelty, and he was holding something small that turned out, when he offered it, to be a small wrist corsage in a pale colour that Charlie thought might have been chosen to complement something he already knew about the dress. The consideration implied in that was not lost on him. "Chief Swan," Edward said. "Good evening." "Come in," Charlie said. "She's not quite ready." They stood in the living room, the two of them, and Charlie reached for the conversation with the practical approach he brought to things he found difficult. "You look," he paused. "Nice," he said, which was not the most articulate thing he had ever produced, but was accurate and seemed like the right register for the moment. "Thank you, sir," Edward said. Then, "I'm glad to have a moment to speak with you before we go. I wanted to say something, if that's all right." Charlie looked at him. "Go ahead." "I know this year has not been uncomplicated," Edward said, and Charlie heard in his voice the particular quality he had been hearing for months now, the precision of someone who chose their words because words mattered to them. "I know that I have not been the easiest person to have in your daughter's life, and that you have extended a degree of trust toward me and my family that I understand was not simple or automatic. I want you to know that I am aware of that, and that I do not take it lightly. Bella is." He paused briefly. "She is the most important thing in my life. I intend to spend a very long time making sure she knows that." Charlie looked at him for a long moment, with the full and considered attention he brought to statements that mattered. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who had received something he was going to sit with rather than respond to immediately, and said, "See that you do." Bella appeared at the top of the stairs, and both of them looked up at the same moment, and Charlie had the strange doubled experience of seeing his daughter clearly as she was, the young woman she had become, and simultaneously seeing the child in the school photographs on the refrigerator, the progression of small faces that had aged in his absence and arrived somehow here, at the top of these stairs in a blue dress that fit her exactly right. She came down carefully, still favouring the leg that had not entirely forgotten what Phoenix had done to it, and Charlie saw Edward move almost imperceptibly to the bottom of the stairs, in a position that was not hovering, but was present, ready, which was the most accurate word for how Edward Cullen generally existed in relation to his daughter. "You look beautiful," Charlie said, because she did, and because some things needed to be said directly, regardless of how they sat in the throat of a man, to whom directness of that kind did not come naturally. Bella's expression shifted in the way it shifted when he managed to surprise her. A warmth came into her face that was unguarded and immediate, and she said, "Thanks, Dad," in a voice that was quieter than her usual speaking voice, which told him the compliment had landed in the place he had intended it to land. He had the camera ready. This was the thing he had prepared most concretely, finding it in the back of the closet, where it had been since the previous summer, and making sure it was charged and that he understood how to use the automatic function. He was not a photographer. He did not have strong feelings about documentation generally, but he understood that these were the photographs that would exist years from now, and that Bella's mother would want copies, and that he himself might want them someday in a way he was not yet ready to articulate. He took more photographs than he had planned to. He took them on the porch with the fork's rain, providing its reliable backdrop, and against the Volvo, which Edward seemed to regard with an affection that Charlie found he could relate to in the way of men who liked their vehicles. He took one of just Bella alone on the porch step, looking at something to the left of the camera, not posed, and when he looked at it in the small screen of the camera afterward, he thought it was probably the best photograph of his daughter he had ever taken. The real version of her, unmanaged and quietly luminous. Edward had opened the car door for her before Charlie had fully lowered the camera, and they were gone. And Charlie was left on the porch in the rain with the camera in his hand and the empty driveway in front of him. He went inside. He made the dinner he had not made yet, because the preparations for the evening had occupied the hours he usually cooked in. It was a simple dinner, eggs and toast, a bachelor's dinner, and he ate it at the kitchen table and then sat in his chair and turned the television on. The game that was playing did not hold his attention. He watched it without watching it, his mind doing the slower, less directed thinking it did when he let it run without specific purpose. Jacob Black called around 8:30, which was unexpected. Jacob was not someone who called Charlie directly, their relationship being more the warmth of proximity than the structure of regular contact, and the call had a slight formality about it that Charlie noticed. Jacob asked about Bella, which was the stated reason for the call, and they talked for a few minutes about her recovery and her return to school and the general trajectory of things. Then Jacob mentioned, in the careful way of a young person relaying something they had been asked to relay, that he had gone to the prom briefly with a message from his father. Charlie leaned back in his chair. "What kind of message?" he said. "Dad wanted me to tell Bella that he hopes she's happy," Jacob said, and there was something in the way he said it that suggested this was a paraphrase of something more complicated, and that if she ever needs anything, the family at La Push is always there. Charlie sat with this. "That's a kind thing to say," he said carefully. "You can tell Billy I said so." After he hung up, Charlie thought about Billy for a while. He thought about their friendship and about the year it had weathered. The strain of disagreeing about something neither of them could fully articulate across the gap between what Billy knew and what Charlie could use. He thought about the fact that Billy's concern had always been, underneath the tradition and the history and the things Charlie could not access, simply about Bella's safety. He had been wrong in Charlie's assessment about the Cullens being a danger to her, but he had not been wrong about caring what happened to her, and Charlie had never confused the two things. He would call Billy tomorrow, not to resolve anything, because there were things between them that were not going to resolve cleanly, but because Billy was his oldest friend, and because some friendships were worth the maintenance even when they had acquired complications. Bella came home at 10 minutes before 11, which was close enough to 11 that Charlie chose not to remark on it. He heard the Volvo in the driveway and the sound of voices briefly before the car door, low and close, and then the specific silence of a conversation that had ended with some deliberateness. and then the front door. She came into the living room and stood in the doorway in her blue dress and her ruined hair. The careful work Alice had done, clearly having met the weather and the dancing and the general entropy of an evening fully lived. And she looked tired in the good way, the way that meant the body had been well used rather than badly treated. "Good time," Charlie said. "Yeah," she said and smiled, and the smile was the unguarded kind. "Really good, actually." "Ed would behave himself?" "Dad, I'm asking." "He was perfect," she said, with a slight exasperation that was entirely affectionate. "He's always perfect. It's occasionally annoying." Charlie considered this and found it, for reasons he could not entirely explain, reassuring in a way that a serious answer would not have been. "Go to bed," he said. "You look tired." She came into the room and bent down and kissed him on the top of his head, which was something she had not done before, not in all the months she had been living with him, and Charlie sat very still with the surprise of it and the warmth of it. And then she was going upstairs, and he was alone in the living room with the television's low noise and the rain outside. He sat for a long time after she went upstairs, not watching the television, not doing anything in particular. He sat in the way he sometimes sat at the end of a long case, when the thing was resolved enough that he could stop actively working it and simply be in the presence of what had happened. He thought about the year, January to May, the grey, wet months of a Forks winter and spring, the truck in the driveway and the light in the spare room and the sound of someone moving through his house after years of no one moving through it. He thought about the things he had accumulated and had not been able to act on, the gaps in stories, the shape of things not quite matching their explanations. He thought about Carlyle across his kitchen table saying she is safe, and about Edward on the porch saying, "The most important thing in my life," and about his daughter at the top of the stairs in a blue dress that fit her exactly right. He did not understand the Cullens. He was fairly certain he was never going to understand the Cullens. Not in the way he understood things he could put in a report and account for completely. That understanding was not available to him, and he had made a kind of peace with that. Not easily, and not all at once, but genuinely, the way a person made peace with the limits of what they could know when the evidence in front of them was sufficient to act from anyway. The evidence in front of him was his daughter, who had come home from her prom happy, and who had kissed him on the top of his head before going upstairs, and who was sleeping in the room above him that had stopped being spare a long time ago. That was evidence enough. That was more than enough. He turned off the television and the lights and went upstairs and paused outside her door, which was closed, and listened to the quiet of the room and the quiet of the house around it. Then he went to his own room and got into bed and lay in the dark listening to the rain, which was doing what the rain in Forks always did, falling without urgency or drama, patient and soft and present, the way the best things in a life were. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, sleep came easily. Charlie Swan never understood what lived in the forest outside Forks. He never understood the full truth of the family his daughter had chosen, or the depth of what she was moving toward, or the cost of what she would eventually leave behind. He was not meant to understand those things. They belonged to a world that existed alongside his own without ever fully intersecting with it, close enough to feel but too far to see clearly. What he understood was his own world. The cruiser in the driveway, and the scanner on the counter, and the coffee measured out before he was fully awake. The fishing, lying in the still water, and Billy beside him saying nothing that needed to be said. The refrigerator covered in school photographs, and the room upstairs that had stopped being empty. He understood that his daughter had come home to him, and that home had become the right word for it, for her, and that this was not something he had known how to hope for before it happened. He kept doing his job. He kept watching, because watching was what he did, and he did not intend to stop. He kept the door open, because open doors were how people came back to you, and he intended for Bella to always be able to come back. Whatever the future held, whatever shape the next chapter of her life was going to take, Charlie Swan was going to be here. In this house, in this town, in this quiet corner of the world, where the rain came down without ceasing, and the forest held its secrets, and a father sat in his chair in the evenings and listened for the sound of the front door. Some loves do not need to be explained. They simply hold. And Charlie Swan's love for his daughter was exactly that kind. Good night.